Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings, the podcast that gets you going before you get going.
Good morning and welcome to Motivational Mornings. My name is Vivi and as always, I'm here with my co-host Ryan. Today we will be discussing the book My Life and Work by Henry Ford from the Ford Company, who helped make automobiles a thing in America after horses. Anyways, he goes into a story and he talks about his experience and kind of goes into the history of how he used to, how he went through his education, how he got a good job, and then how he kind of left it to pursue this idea of developing the automobile based on some designs and things that he'd been looking at in the market. But I thought it'd be good to go into, because everyone knows the story of Henry Ford, how he invented the car, generally speaking, and I don't think the minutiae are super important, but the points that he talks about, I think, Ryan, maybe you'd agree as well, seem to, for most part, at least stay true to today. And this book is written about 100 years ago. Just an interesting thought to think about. One of the first points that he talks about when talking about making a business is he says, you cannot have leisure and work at the same time. He doesn't really believe in the work-life balance, especially, he says, if you're trying to build a business. He says if you are, you need to work in the business during the day, during the duration of the day. And then when you go home at night, you need to think about the business and need to dream about the business and how to improve it for the next day. Now, obviously, he was more skewed on the standpoint of wanting to innovate and create something very, very new, and that would be true for those people more so. But I just like the commitment that he outlines in that point. Another thing he talks about that I think is very interesting is thinking first of money instead of thinking first on the production or the service is a fault that he found way back in the beginning of the 20th century. And I also really still feel like this holds true today. Henry Ford says, thinking first of money instead of work brings on failure because of the anxiety of having to make money right away. He says, focus on the work and providing the absolute best service, and then the money will take care of itself. Kind of like the whole Jeff Bezos Amazon thing. Customer service is number one. For 20 years, they lost a lot of money. 10 years, they're losing a lot of money. People were like, Amazon's never going to make money. And where are they now? Another point I like that he discusses was that Henry Ford makes it very clear that he doesn't expect, nor does he believe, everyone should make a huge company like the Ford Company. But he says that there are way too many smart people doing ordinary things. He thinks that the ordinary way to do business never really makes a large improvement on the current situation of the world. Therefore, he talks about not being an ordinary person in your life. Do something unordinary in your life's work. Do something different. Do things differently and make things better from a larger standpoint. That's what he talks about. Another point that maybe I'll just briefly bring up also is how Henry Ford really makes the argument against how people and workers are less and less skilled these days. And this is way back again, 100 years ago. So he's really adamant on this point, and it really made me think and pause about the situation and gather the facts on what's actually currently going on in the world. Henry Ford makes the argument against people saying that workers are less and less skilled, because he says, in reality, the workers are actually more and more skilled, because there are more skilled ways that can enable you and your workers who are previously not skilled to even have a job and a way of living and supporting yourselves. Henry Ford says that before the Industrial Revolution came to be, factories and all that stuff, before that came to be, the unskilled workers were left poor and dead because they couldn't support support themselves. They couldn't find money, and they died because they died of hunger and died of things that were the result of not having money. He says that what the reality is, and I think this also maybe holds true, is that there's such a big division between skilled and unskilled, but in reality, because we have such hyper-skilled positions, we enable the people who are less skilled to have a job and support themselves when that wasn't the thing 100 years ago.
I want to go back to a point, Vivi, that you touched on briefly about Ford's business philosophy. I just found this wild because a lot of these points are true today, but this book was written like 100 years ago. And so Ford talks about how usually business was conducted to give a large attention to the finances of the business and really a small attention to the actual service. It wasn't about how good the car was, it was about how much money the car could sell for. I think some businesses actually are still run like this today, but I don't necessarily agree with that. And Henry Ford definitely did not agree with that. So he thought that there wasn't really much thought that would be given to what would happen to after the car was sold. So the car would maybe it'd break down easily, maybe it'd use a lot of gas per mile. Traditionally, his original investors or the other companies, they wouldn't care. They thought as soon as the car was sold, that was it, they were done. So Henry Ford didn't agree with this, and he thought that when they sold the car, that was actually just the introduction. That was the starting point. And then they had to make sure that the car was good quality so that the customer would be satisfied. Now, the original investors, the original companies, they thought a dissatisfied customer wasn't someone's trust had been broken, but it was just a nuisance. Or even worse, it was a new possible source of money because now someone had to pay to fix a car. And so the strategy would be to sell the repair parts for the car for as much as possible because the owner had already bought the car, so they had no choice but go to get these parts. So it was very short-term sighted, and they weren't really building any kind of long-term relationship or long-term customer loyalty. But now Ford, and now I think this is revolutionary because this is 100 years ago, but his thought was to play the long-term game. So he was all about the quality. He was all about the customer relationship because he thought the best advertising was if you have a satisfied customer, they are going to go by word of mouth to bring in more customers to help grow the business. Now, I want to talk about another point that Ford had in this book. So when Ford first started building the automobile, there was initially no demand for it. And now people will be telling him that at most the automobile would be like a toy. Now, looking back, this does seem kind of funny because that people were telling him the cars had no viable future in this world, which we look at today, and it's crazy. We look at Tesla, one of like the most popular companies right now. What do they make? Cars.
Yeah, it's really quite interesting, Ryan, when you think about how people think about these sorts of things at the time and then how obviously things have transitioned since. Another couple points I wanted to bring out were more operational things, and these are more things that if you're in a business or running a business, or you're thinking about running a business, or you have an idea of how to improve the business you're in. I think these are really interesting points to consider. First of all, Henry Ford talks about the fact that the employers, people who started the company, must work harder than the employees initially, and maybe for a while, he says. And he says, if you do not do this, the employees will never work at their best potential just because they don't see the employers setting the precedence. I think that's interesting. A lot of the businesses today, you tend to get like diverted leadership and people who maybe are off doing gallivanting, doing fancy things, while you have the people who are working in the trenches and getting things done as really unglorified. But Henry Ford was not like this at all. Interesting point that even back when the Industrial Revolution came to be, even when machines started getting utilized more and more and people started relying on machinery, Henry Ford was within the day-to-day operations for a very, very long time, and he made some very, very crucial decisions. Decisions like you can compare to probably entrepreneurs and leaders like Elon Musk, with him being super involved into Tesla, SpaceX on a very, very detailed orientation perspective. People like Jeff Bezos with Blue Origin and Amazon still coming back when there's fires to be put out. People like Bill Gates prior to him transitioning leadership was very, very involved to the very end. All of these companies, is it really a coincidence that they've revolutionized some of the ways that they've done things, and a lot of ways invented new ways of doing new things? I don't think it's a coincidence, to be honest. Another point that operationally he talks about is how salaries, he thinks, should all be out in the open and standardized. Henry Ford's really, really went in about salaries, and I found it quite fascinating. He thinks that most salaries should be standardized, and at the end of the year, when all the numbers have come in, then he thinks the redistribution of the sales or the profits of the employees should be part of everyone's bonuses. Maybe they'll be stratified according to responsibilities, but I think that's a really interesting idea, how like everyone's like, hey, this is what you get per tier of where you're at. At the end of the year, if you perform, you get a lot better. And if we are better together, then we all grow. But if we're not, we all suffer. Seems like a lot more fair way of doing things, and it's interesting to think about. A lot of business cultures don't really, I don't feel, see it that way. It's all like, don't ask, don't tell about my salary. Some people getting us significantly more than others without deeming it super necessary. A lot of people in different fields go through this process of getting paid, a wage that's very, very low compared to people who are not really doing much more than they are. So I thought that was interesting. And lastly, I found it quite interesting how when Fenry talks about titles, he doesn't like titles at all. He says that titles in business are greatly overdone. Titles meaning CEO, CFO, marketing manager, supervisor, etc. He says titles don't do anything but communicate with someone that who is and who isn't important. And if you really think about it, that's what they do. Oh, he's a CEO, CFO, and that must mean he's important. He's a manager or associate. Oh, associate. He must be, just starting off and not really meaningful to the company. He says that Ford never had in the early days titles. And in result, everyone communicated to everyone else like they were peers. When you do have titles, everyone else knows that they're less or more important than the other person next to them. He says, do not use titles. And going forward in my businesses, I am going to try and stay away from titles, especially when trying to just discuss and collaborate within stratification and making groups and ideas in the future, because I feel like anyone can contribute to the overall greater being of the company. And it goes back all the way to the other podcasts that we have talked about idea meritocracies. If you guys remember that, Ray Dalio talks about the idea meritocracy, meaning that the best idea from whoever says the idea, janitor or the CEO, persists within the company after discussing that idea or that merit of the idea. And that wraps up today's episode at Motivational Mornings. If you like this book and any of the other books that we talked about, feel free to check out our link for a free 30-day trial of Audible through audibletrial.com/motivational mornings. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.